Hello, good afternoon.
How do you do?
Okay, welcome. My name is Rabbi Helfgot, Nati Helfgot, and we are in these sessions. We are looking at the notion of the revealed Torah, traditional conceptions about the revelation of the law. Last time, in our first session, we discussed the notion of how God revealed what we come to know as the written law. That was the topic of our last topic, of our first session, which was all about not so much the process of writing the law, but before the law was written, it was first communicated orally by God through Moshe. Parts of it were directly communicated by God, parts of it through Moshe as a conduit, and that was the topic that we discussed last time. Today we're going to begin our 3 sessions which will address different theories about the notion of an oral law, which is supposed to be the focus of this series. And that is the notion of how exactly, conceptually, we believe the oral law was revealed. What is the scope of the oral law? When we say Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral law, what do we mean by that? And some of the different debates surrounding the topic of the oral law. So I'd like to start. You have sheets in front of you, as well as those who are following along online. I understand that they shared the sheets with you. Many of the sources are in Hebrew, but I will translate everything that so that it'll be crystal clear.
Before
Yeah.
we start, can I ask you?
You can ask me anything you want.
Please define the word oral law.
So that's part of my job in the course of the sessions.
It's going to unroll.
It's going to unroll because it's a very vague term actually when we say it. And that's exactly part of what, okay? So I'd like to start first with what doesn't exist and then talk about what does exist. If one looks in the Bible and one looks at the story of the giving of the law, the Bible never says that God gave an oral law alongside a written law. It never says, there is no explicit statement in the Bible saying that, okay? That's what I want to make very clear. Meaning, the Bible tells us about many things that God did. He took the Jews out of Egypt. He spoke to Moses. He gave the 10 commandments at Sinai. He told them this. He told them that. He gave them this commandment. But the Bible never makes a big deal about the notion that there was a bifurcated revelation. A revelation of a written law and a revelation of a oral law. First of all, as I said, all the law first was oral because God communicated it. It was only at a certain point that what we know as the Torah Shebichtav, the written law, gets committed to writing. But the notion that there's an oral law and a written law is not a biblical concept. What I mean by that is it never explicitly states that alongside a written law, an oral law was given. It never states that in the 5 books of Moses. It never states that in the book of Yehoshua. It never states that in the book of Isaiah. It never states it in the book of Daniel. Nowhere does it explicitly outline such a theological concept. That's the first point I want to make. So we have to understand it because, again, if it explicitly said that in the Bible, we wouldn't have had the great schisms in Jewish history, like the Karaites and the Sadducees, who denied the existence of an oral law, who denied the existence of, alongside the written law, there's an oral law. In fact, the great motto of the Karaites in the Middle Ages was, look into the Bible. Istakel ba'oraita. Look into the Bible to find everything, and don't rely on any oral tradition. Yes?
Do they know about what time the written law was written?
Okay, so again, this is a big debate. According to our traditional, again, in these sessions I'm working within traditional categories and traditional thinkers. So in traditional thought, and this is a very famous debate, the Talmud records a debate how the Torah was committed to writing. What we know today as the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch in German, that book, how is it committed to writing? There is one approach which says Torah Chatuma Nitna, that when you open up the Bible, at the very end of Parshat Vayelech, which is at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, so the Bible says, right before the song of Ha'azinu. So the Bible says in that passage that Moses, in chapter 31, towards the end of Moses' life, it says, "Vayichtov Moshe et haTorah hazot, vayitna el haKohanim bnei Levi hanosim et Aron brit Hashem v'et kol ziknei Yisrael." And Moses wrote down this Torah. Now the question is, what is it a reference when it says this Torah? Is it a reference to what we call the Mishnah Torah, the book of Deuteronomy, or is it a reference to the entire Torah? So the rabbis understood this as a reference to the entire Torah.
Torah or Hora'ah that you're talking
The
about?
Torah. The Torah that we now
Torah
know
that
as
we
the
know
as
as
the
the-
written law. So according to one tradition in the Gemara, Torah Chatuma Nitna, which means, and this is the way that we are brought up as kids, that at the end of Moses' life, God dictated to Moses the content of what we call the 5 books of Moses, from A to Z, from Aleph to Taf. And God communicated to Moshe Rabbeinu the stories of Breshit and the laws of Vayikra and etc. And that, in one fell swoop, was written and communicated. Okay, meaning the laws had been given orally during the course of the experience at Sinai and the 40 years in the desert. But the writing of the written law, according to this approach in the Gemara, this is called Torah Chatuma Nitna. The Torah was written in one shot.
Signed and sealed.
Signed and sealed from A to Z. The second approach, which has some roots, has some hints in the Bible, is called Torah Megillah Nitnu. Megillah Nitna, which means that the Torah was written in a serial fashion. Serial with an S, not a C. Okay? It was written over the course of the various junctures in the 40 years. And so, according to this approach, the Bible, let's say, when the Jews reached Sinai, so the Bible describes in chapter 24 of the book of Mishpatim, of the book of Exodus, a covenant ceremony where the blood is sprinkled on the Mizbeach and it's sprinkled on the Jewish people, and the Jewish people send Na'aseh v'nishma. And in that chapter, it says, Vayichtov Moshe et Sefer HaBrit. Moshe writes a book of covenant. So what is the book of covenant? So Rashi there cites the opinion, which is a debate, that the book of covenant is from Bereshit up until that point in Jewish history, up until Matan Torah, up until the giving of the Torah. So according to that approach, the Torah was written Siriatam piecemeal over the course of. So at Sinai, a chunk of Torah was written. And then more events occurred. The Mishkan commandments and the Chet HaEgel, the sin of the golden calf, and the building of the Ohel Moed. And then, at that point, maybe a few years later, God said, okay, now I want you to write another scroll, Megillah. And then at the end of the 40 years, God said, take all these scrolls, put them together, patchwork them together, and commit them as one entire book, which we know today as the Torah. So to answer, that's a very short answer to your it's a very complex question, but that is the two reigning theories about the writing of the Torah. Now, as I mentioned last week, we saw some sources about this. There is a debate within traditional sources. Again, I'm staying all within the world of tradition, whether there were parts of the small parts, little parts of the Torah that may have been added post-Mosaic, right? So, for example, Maimonides takes the position that nothing, not even one word, is post-Mosaic. That to be an observant Orthodox Jew, you must believe that every single word in the Bible, even glosses, even little, there was no editing post-Moses. Everything starts from Moses, because Moses' unique prophecy, it came to Moshe, and he committed it to writing, period. However, there were opinions in the Talmud, for example, the last 8 verses of the Bible, which describe Moses dead. So how can you write when you're dead? So the Gemara actually records a debate. One opinion says Moshe wrote it, Nevuah, in prophecy, B'dema, as he was crying. And another opinion says Joshua wrote it, because Joshua wrote it and that's legitimate. So that's a different approach entirely. That's an approach that says that there are parts of the Bible that can be post-Mosaic. How far can you go with that is a big debate. Rambam said not at all. There were voices in medieval Ashkenaz and Sfarad where we find people who were willing to entertain, scholars, rabbis, who were willing to entertain the notion that small phrases here and there may have been edited later by later prophets in order to explain to the generation that was reading it in a better way, and that this became incorporated into the canonical text of the Torah. Or that passages that seem to be written later were written later to explicate. Now this, again, the Rambam would say that such a theory is heresy, but there were people like the Ibn Ezra and Rav Yehuda HaChassid and others who were willing to entertain that. Again, now nobody, there are two important points. Nobody was willing to entertain that whole swaths of the Bible were written post-Mosaic. That's very different than, let's say, Bible criticism today. And they certainly seem, many of them believed that it was divinely inspired, meaning that the people who edited the Bible also had divine inspiration, and so they were allowed to add a comment here or there to clarify something, but not that people were just writing on their own whatever they wanted in the Bible as kind of, etc. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, Rambam has those 13 principles.
Correct, which we talked about. Yeah,
And
Leslie.
isn't the first one?
No, the eighth. The eighth principle is the principle of Torah min hashamayim. The belief in but again, that's Maimonides. I just wanted to share with you that not everyone agrees. But again, that's certainly the mainstream view. The mainstream view throughout Jewish history was that the entire Torah, the written Torah, was divine, was given to God, was given by God to Moshe Rabbeinu. Everyone agrees that it's divine. The question is, can small parts be post-Mosaic? Okay, but that's Torah shebichtav. We are focusing today on Torah sheba'al peh, the oral law. So, as I said, as I started, the notion that there exists an oral law is not an indigenous biblical notion. It never appears. Nowhere, for example, if you look at the story of Matan Torah, black on white, when God appears at Sinai, he says, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am the Lord your God. And then, at a certain point, Moses comes down with the two luchot. It never says he came down with the luchot, and he also came down with an oral tradition. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say he didn't do it, but it doesn't say anywhere explicit. However, the rabbis, and again, if you were a historian of ideas, this is like an interesting kind of question. Where is the first time that idea appears in rabbinic circles? Is an interesting question. I don't think we can nail it down.
Yeah,
Where
the
exactly?
Torah should be all peh.
The idea that an oral law alongside a written law was communicated, where was that idea first communicated is not, again, I don't know. One thing is clear, that in the Second Temple period, this idea was very much alive. We have many sources that clearly indicate that this was a very central tenet of what we call today Rabbinic Judaism, and was a major bone of contention between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, the Prushim and the Tzedukim, around the issue of, do they have an oral law? And then there were different disagreements of what the oral law was. Is this by tradition? Is this not by tradition? Etc., etc. Okay. So just to show, let's start with the sources, just to show you three very famous sources about the existence of an oral law. One is the Sifra. Sifra is a Tannaitic work. It says in the book of Vayikra, on the book of Leviticus, the Midrash Halacha on Leviticus. So in the beginning of Parshat Bechukotai in the Torah, so the Torah has a very interesting phrase, which in a context means something very, very specific. The Bible says, in that context, at the end, let me just find it. Yeah, at the very end of Parshat Bechukotai, in chapter 26, the Bible says, as a summary, Eila hachukim v'hamishpatim v'hatorot asher natan Hashem beino b'nei Yisrael b'har Sinai b'yad Moshe. Now the verse in context doesn't mean Torot, two Torahs. It means the laws. Just like the Bible says, Zot Torah HaMitzorah, Zot Torah HaYoledet. The word Torah in the Torah means a teaching, a section of teaching. Zot Torah HaYoledet. This is the laws of a woman who gives childbirth. What is the halachic status? So when it says Eila Chukim v'Mishpatim v'Torot, it means these are the laws. And the word, again, also the word Chukim in the Bible doesn't mean like what we're taught today, which is a rabbinic distinction between laws that are rational and laws that have no. That's a rabbinic distinction. In the Bible, the word Chok just means an ongoing law. Chok keeps going. Mishpatim and Torot. But the rabbis in the Midrash says as follows: Eila Chukim v'Mishpatim v'Torot. HaChukim Elu HaMidrashot. This refers to the Midrash Halacha, to the rabbinic exegesis on the text. V'hamishpatim eila hadinim. This refers to laws that were given without any explanation in the text, exegesis. V'hatorot milamed sheshtei torot nitnu lahem liYisrael. This teaches us, the rabbis are making a play. The word Torot here is a reference to the two Torahs. One which is Torah Sheba'al Peh, Torah Shebichsav, one which is Torah Sheba'al Peh. So this is one of the famous places where the rabbis make the ideological statement that there is a thing alongside a written law was an oral law. And this is, now parenthetically, I would note that this is not unique just to the Jewish tradition. There are other cultures that also had a notion that in addition to whatever text they had, they also had interpretations on that text, because by its very nature, a text can never be exhaustive. And you can't really run a society often just by one, okay? I'll give you just an example. The Code of Hammurabi. The Code of Hammurabi, it's clear today to scholars that it was not exhaustive and it doesn't cover all the cases. There must have been more oral teachings around it that, again, just like, and in Islam, you have the Quran and then you have the Hadith. You have the teachings around the Quran. It's just the nature of any society. It's not exhaustive. Another famous Gemara, Gemara Brachot Daf Hey. The Bible in chapter 24 of Shmot, in that story I mentioned to you, the covenant ceremony at Sinai, so where the Jewish people said Na'aseh v'nishma, so the text says that Moshe goes up to get the luchos. So in chapter 24, verse 12, this is the verse. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe le'elai hahara ve'yesham v'atna lecha et luchot ha'even. I will give you the luchot ha'even v'atorah v'amitzvah asher katavti lahorotam. And I will give you the Torah and the mitzvah which I have written to teach them. Now, the simple reading of the text means I'm going to give you the stones upon which I have written the Torah and the mitzvah, meaning what we call the 10 commandments, which is really 14 commandments. It's actually Aseret HaDvarim, the 10 statements in the biblical language. It's actually 14 commandments. So the Bible, what? I'm sorry, it doesn't sound as well.
No? Could you tell us what they are?
Just add a few in the first two. What's called Anochi, existence of God, but it also has Lo Yeh Lecha Elohim Acharim Al Panai. Then it says Lo Tishtachave Lehem, Lo Ta'avdeim, Lo Sa'aseh Lehem. There are really four more there than, okay? So, okay. So it's, I don't know why, the 10 Commandments stuck, but in the Bible it's never called Aseret HaMitzvot. It's called Aseret HaDvarim, or Aseret HaDibrot in rabbinic language. It became feminized. I don't know why either. In the Bible it's in the masculine, Aseret HaDvarim. Okay, so there the verse is talking about the content of the luchos, but the rabbis, in a hyper reading, which was the nature of Midrash, the rabbis said, Amar Rabbi Levi bar Chama, Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Mai dichtiv. What is the verse? V'etna lechat luchot ha'even v'atorah v'mitzvah shekatavti lahorotam. Luchot elu aseret hadibrot. The rabbis like to atomize. You know what I mean? Not itemize, atomize. Every word was taken as a separate unit. That's the nature of midrashic exegesis. You take a verse and you atomize each one individually. Luchot elu aseret hadibrot. Torah zem mikra. This refers to the entirety of Tanakh was already given, whatever that means. Mitzvah zu Mishnah. Mitzvah refers to Mishnah. The word asher katafti, these refer to the laws in the Nevi'im and Ketuvim. Lahorotam ze Gemara. Melamed shekulam nitnu l'Moshe miSinai. So this is a rabbinic exegesis which ties the entirety of the corpus of law, both written and oral. Mishnah here doesn't necessarily mean the corpus of the book called Mishnah. It means all the laws that we find in the Mishnah, which were communicated in apodictic form. Do this, do that, this case, that case, that case. Okay. Gemara means the thinking through contradictions, explanations, resolutions. Gemara is a way of learning in this model. But this is one of the classic rabbinic texts which ties all of Jewish literature, of Jewish literature, rabbinic literature, and Bible into one package, one ball. And God gave them all at Sinai. He may not necessarily have given it in the form that we have it today. That's my little knach on it. But the content was all there. And again, now this begins to touch on the issue which we're not going to focus on as much today yet. We'll start with the Rambam, but we won't finish it today. This is a very far-reaching claim, because this claim is that the entire corpus of what we know as the oral law really goes back to Sinai. There is nothing creative in what the rabbis did, but the rabbis are simply unearthing, recovering. It's a rescue mission from everything that was already said at Sinai. That's the conception here, that everything that was said at Sinai, everything was already given. Everything that's in the Mishnah and in the Gemara, it's all back there already at Sinai. And this idea leads to the first conception of Torah Sheba'al Peh that we have in our tradition, which is the very traditional one, and the one that I think if you ask the average Haredi Jew, they would sign on the dotted line, and that is the notion that what we are doing, what the rabbis in the Gemara are doing, is simply trying to retrieve what may have been lost and try to uncover what was already given at Sinai. That's what all we're doing. We're trying to, what's called Degem HaShichzur in modern Hebrew. L'shachzer means to recreate and re-unearth what already was there. So here's another example, Gemara in Temura, which goes in that direction. Elef ushva meot kalin v'chomrim. Okay? 1,700 kal v'chomers, as we would say in English. You know what a kal v'chomer is? An a fortiori argument. A fortiori argument. If this is true in such a weak case, certainly it would be true. If in the strong case we hold this, certainly in the weak case we would hold this. So the Gemara says there were 1,700 laws derived by kal v'chomer, Gzeira Shavot, and laws derived by Gzeira Shava. Gzeira Shava is paralleling. It says this word in this verse, it says this word in this verse, and we learn one verse from the other, the content of one area from another area. V'dikdukei sofrim, and certain dikdukim, certain laws that the rabbis inferred. Nishtakhu, were forgotten b'yamei evlo shel Moshe. Meaning, all the laws had already been developed in the time of Moshe. Amar Rav Yabo, afal pikein hichziron Otniel ben Knaz mitoch pilpulo. But Otniel ben Knaz, who was the first judge, was able to unearth it through his Torah study. So it's interesting. The idea being that there was all of the law that we know as oral law was already there back in the time of Moshe, but it was forgotten, and then it was unearthed. Now, it can be forgotten again and unearthed again. It can be forgotten again and unearthed again through the vicissitudes of history and the challenges that the Jewish people experienced throughout the ages. Yes?
But as they unearthed them, there certainly were disagreements among
We'll get to that.
rabbis.
So we're going to get to that. In this theory, we're going to have to ask ourselves, what exactly is the nature of machaloket? Why is there debates? So the answer would probably be something along the lines of, there are debates about whether this unearthing is the correct unearthing. It's not a debate about logic as much as, do you have a good tradition that points in this direction, or do you not have a good tradition? Do you have a good argument? But it's a debate about whether what you've done is an accurate rendition of the original law. Now, here's another example of etc. Now, I want to talk a little bit. I brought you some English sources about why exactly is there a need for an oral law? Why didn't God just give everything in one fell swoop? What, didn't have enough room? Didn't have enough paper? They ran out of ink?
There was no paper in those days.
Right?
Enough
Papyrus,
stones,
enough stones, enough papyrus. What exactly is the nature? Is there a theory of why? So I just wanted to show you a couple of sources that go in that direction. So we've posited in rabbinic literature, and again, I could have quoted you another 10 sources, that of the notion of the existence of an oral law. We have not yet posited the scope of that oral law. But there is an oral law. And we've already seen one model in rabbinic literature that says that it all goes back to Sinai, and it all was given at Sinai, and we are kind of trying to relearn everything we lost, like that beautiful midrash about how we learn everything in the womb, and then the malach touches us here, and then we go and all our life is about trying to recapture that lost knowledge, which is a very famous.
I haven't heard that since I was a child.
Right.
Can I say something, please?
Sure.
Mikra comes from karo. It is something that we read. Quran is that which is read.
Right.
The same word.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Now. Okay. Now. When I was in high school, I had a teacher who made a joke. He said that we were taught that this comes from the angel. So there's another midrash that says that every angel has one job in their life. So what does the angel do after he's touched us in the womb? What does he go to? He goes to Boca for the rest of his life. He retires. What does the angel do? So but each angel has one job. He's got one person. So the joke was that he comes back and follows us the rest of the life for every summer vacation and winter vacation. So we forget everything we learned during the course of the school year, and then we have to learn it again. So that was the cute idea. Anyway, so here's a couple of sources that address the question of what exactly is the purpose of why God in his infinite wisdom believed in the notion of an oral law. So here's a couple of sources. This is from a Tanchuma. This is Tanchuma. Though I write for him the great things of my Torah.
Excuse me, what number are we?
We're up to number 3, page 1, number 3.
Page 1.
Okay, this is a citation in English from the Tanchuma. Though I write for him the great things of thy Torah, they are reckoned a strange thing. Rabbi Yehuda Bar Shalom said, when the Holy One, blessed be He, said to Moshe, Ktov lecha, write for you the Torah, Moshe asked that the Mishnah be given in writing. However, because God foresaw that the nations of the world would eventually translate the Torah and read it into Greek, saying that they are Israel, the claims of both sides thus being equal, the Holy One, blessed be He, said to the Gentiles, you say that you are my children. All I know is that those by whom my mysteries reside are my children. What is that? That is the Mishnah that was given orally. So this Tanchuma basically sees it as a polemic. This Mishnah, again, if you read between the lines here, it does not so much the Greeks, it's about the Christians, really. The Christians said, we are the real Israel. We are the true, Veritas Israel. Veros Israel. And this is the claim that what makes Jews unique is we have the correct interpretation. But that was given to us secretly. What's secret? Orally. Passed on from generation. You have to be in the club. You have to be in the inner circle. If it's written...
They can't point to
right, exactly. So this is one notion that you find in rabbinic literature. A second notion, another midrash, source number 5. Someone may ask you, why the words of the scribes were not given in a written form in the same way that the words of the Torah were. Tell him that it is because it is impossible to write down all their words. That is the implication of the verse. And furthermore, my son, be admonished, of making many books there is no end. Because if you would attempt to write down their words, you would find the material for making the books to be endless and unlimited. Now this is a very different notion. This is not a notion that the writing of the oral law is essential because it's unique to Israel. The existence of an oral law is a kind of inner code by which God divides between the Gentiles and the Jews. But this is a notion that somehow, by the very nature of oral law, is that it cannot be fully written down. It's amplified. A teaching leads to a question, which leads to another teaching, which leads to another teaching, and it is continuously bubbling. And so by its very nature, it had to remain amorphous. And Rav Yosef Albo, who was one of the great theologians of Spain in the late 1300s, Rav Yosef Albo wrote a very famous book called the Ikarim. So he writes in the Ikarim as follows: For God's Torah cannot be complete in such a way that it will suffice for all times. For the new particulars that constantly come into being regarding human affairs are far too many to be contained in a book. Therefore, the general rules that are briefly alluded to in the Torah were transmitted orally to Moshe at Sinai, in order for the sages of every generation to derive therefrom the new particulars. So this is a very far-reaching statement that the nature of human society and the nature of changing circumstances, physical, economic, social, political, religious, by their very nature mean that you can never, if you put the law in a book, it kind of limits it. You leave it more amorphous. The rabbis are given general principles orally of how to use the principles in the written law to apply them to new situations, expand and contract, explain and apply to new situations.
But is that also true of the written law?
No, because the written law
N-
is
so
set.
that-
It's a kind of set, never changed. It has kind of absolute principles. But the oral law is, and in his conception, the oral law consists mostly of principles that are given to the rabbis in order to uncover and use the written law to uncover how to apply certain principles in the new situations. Rav Moshe Glasner, who was a great-grandson of Chassam Sofer, an author of a sefer called Dor Revi, which is on Chulin, Masechet Chulin, very interesting guy. So he writes a very interesting introduction to his book. So this is one of the quotes from his book. Anyone who wants not to pervert the truth must reach the conclusion that the Torah's explanation was transmitted orally and forbidden to be written in order not to fix for all generations and not to tie the hands of the sages of every generation, thus preventing them from explaining the verses as they understood them. For this is the only way to establish the eternity of the Torah. Because as for the changes in the generations, their ideas, their situation, their physical and moral state require changes in the law, enactments, and emendations. So this is a very far-reaching argument that's used very often by thinkers of that nature. Okay?
Life is constantly
Right.
changing.
Correct. And finally, in this area, also in order for people, this is from the Sma, one of the great Achronim on the Shulchan Aruch, in order for people not to rely on what is written in front of them, and thus refrain from occupying themselves in Torah with the intensity that is required when the material is studied orally. So number one, he says that giving part of the law orally ensured that people would have to study it carefully, go to a teacher, a master, to hear the interpretation. Then it is necessary to constantly meditate upon the material in order to remember it and not forget it. That way, they will derive many laws through their own reasoning. And I say that God did not want the oral law to be written for yet another reason. A written text may have multiple interpretations. Had the oral law not been committed to writing, but rather the halacha with its explanation would have been transmitted from sage to person. There would have never been disagreements, and we have not had to spend all our days in confusion explaining the halacha. And that's it would have. There would have never have been the great involvement in discussion and debate. That's the end of the second part. What I'd like to do now is begin to talk about the scope of what is included in Torah Shebaal Peh. So the rest of today's session and the next session will focus on Rambam, Maimonides' conception of the oral law, and then we're going to move to Ramban, Nachmanides' conception of the oral law, and see how much we cover, and then we'll see what else for the last session. So Maimonides discusses the nature of the oral law in about 3 or 4 places in his writings. Okay, one place is the introduction to the Mishnah. He wrote a commentary to the Mishnah when he was in his 20s. Not Shmona Parakim is the introduction to his commentary in Pirkei Avot on the Mishnah. But he also wrote an introduction to the entire commentary, which is called the Hakdama LePerush HaMishnayot. And in the Hakdama, he has a wide-ranging theory of the development of the oral law, which not everyone agreed to, but it's his theory. And Maimonides was a very major player. So we are going to look at that. There's also another part where he discusses it is in his introduction to Mishnah Torah, to his code. He also discusses it in the Sefer HaSharashim, in the book Sefer HaMitzvot, in the book of commandments, which he wrote after this. And he has 14 Shorashim, 14 roots, where he discusses what and what not to be included in the 613. We'll talk about that. And then finally, he has a discussion of it in a number of passages in Hilchot Mamrim, in the laws of Sanhedrin, about the nature of the role of the great court in Jerusalem and what role it plays in legislating law. So let's start. So Rambam here has a very famous 5-part distinction of what is included in what we call the Mishnah and Gemara. And he wants to try to identify of the 5 types of material that appear, besides stories and advice and agadita, but in terms of the law, the Rambam divides the material that's found in the Mishnah and the Gemara into 5 categories. Okay? And for our purposes, we will today focus very much on the first 3 categories. So let's read this. This is in the middle of the introduction. So he spent a long time presenting it. Now he's going to summarize it. So we're just reading the summary. According to the principles we have put forth previously, Hadinim HaMiyusadim BaTorah, the laws that we call the oral law, that are based on the written law, Nechlakim l'shchamisha chalakim. They divide into 5 units. Unit 1, HaChelek HaRishon, HaPerushim HaMekubalim Mipi Moshe Sheyesh Lahem Remez BaTorah Onotziam B'derech Svara V'zo Ein Bahem Machloket Lo'olam Ela K'sheyomar Echad Kach Kibalti Ein L'daber Alav. So the Rambam says a very important thing. The Rambam says that the first category are received, it's his term, Perushim HaMekubalim, received traditions of what a verse means, which has a hint in the Torah, meaning it's basing itself on a text. And there is no debate about these laws in the corpus of the law. I'll give you an example. The Rambam gave his examples. It says in the Bible, "Ukshartem la'ot al yadecha," and you shall put a sign on your arm, "Vayultot afot beinechem," and you should put a sign or something between your eyes. So there's a verse that talks about doing something on your arm but what is it? What is an oath? What is a sign? You put a little sticker. So Rambam says we have a tradition going back to Moses that this verse means tefillin, a leather box containing 4 compartments, within it a certain part of the scroll of the Torah. For the Rambam, that is called a Perush HaMikubal Mimoshe Rabbeinu. And this is the first part of literally Torah Shebe'al Peh. When you use the term Torah Shebe'al Peh, it does not refer to the entirety of the Gemara. It specifically refers to 2 categories, these first 2 categories. Category number 1 is received interpretations, accepted, received interpretations of biblical texts, what it means.
Does anybody know when people first started to wear tefillin?
So the Rambam would say there's no first, they always wore tefillin. For the Rambam, they always wore tefillin. This is something that you will never find a dispute about in the Bible, in the Talmud. In the Talmud, there was never a dispute that that's what the verse meant, as opposed to other verses where you have disputes. You will not find anywhere in rabbinic literature a dispute about what that verse means, which for the Rambam, he believes it goes back to Sinai. Now, it may have been lost somewhere, okay, fine. But for the Rambam, this was given orally by God to Moshe Rabbeinu. And he passed that on. Whether everyone was careful about keeping, well, that's a different issue. But the law, the interpretation, went hand in hand with the Bible. Yes?
I remember that they found...
Tefillin going back to Masada, yeah.
Yeah, but they were round.
So they were a little different. Okay, fine. There were debates maybe on details. There may have been... And there were also, remember, sectarian Jews. The Dead Sea Scroll people were not mainstream normative Jews in the way... They are not our ancestors, in the sense of, our ancestors, the Essenes or or whatever group the Dead Sea group was, they were sectarians. Okay? That's not sectarians. They were a little bit separated from the mainstream of what we come to know as Rabbinic Judaism, just like the Sadducees. They were similar but different. They were an offshoot group. It's like if somebody today, I'll give you an example. Let's say, God forbid, 10,000 years from now, somebody, we disappear, and somebody discovered the books of the Ethiopian Jews and how they practiced Judaism. And you would make an argument that that was what the Jewish people did. That's not true. Normative Jews for the last 2,000 years have not practiced halakha the way Ethiopian Jews, because they were cut off by history, by geography from the mainstream development of Jewish law. So it would be just as false. That's why you have to be very wary of making too many conclusions from very partial evidence from what they found in the Dead Sea about certain things, because that may have been the practice of this group, but not necessarily many other groups. To be very careful. When you find something, that it's really representative of the broad culture rather than just a small group. Okay? That's not always easy to tell. But the more you find of material culture and books, if you find the same book in the Dead Sea Scroll library, and you find it in the library up in the north, and you find it in the south of Israel, then you get a sense, this was obviously a widespread book that most people took as sacred. But if you find a book that you only find in the Dead Sea Scroll library, but you don't find it in the normative communities in other places in Israel, you've got to worry, yeah? Okay? Okay. So that's the first category. And for the Rambam, the litmus test...
Is this halacha l'Moshe Sinai?
No, that is not halacha l'Moshe Sinai. That term is not to be used. Because for the Rambam, the term is Perushim HaMikubalim MiSinai. These are authorized, accepted, transmitted interpretations, and that's what the verse means. Again, and the Rambam came from the Spanish school rather than the Ashkenazi school. And in the Spanish school of biblical interpretation, a text has one meaning. It has a true meaning. And the one true meaning of this verse, says the Rambam, it's not that there's a pshat, which is a metaphor. Ukshartim la'ot al yadecha, you should put a sign on your arm. And then there's a drash. No. The meaning of the verse is the Perush HaMikubal MiSinai. In these cases, now how many cases are there? 20, 40, 50. It's not the bulk of the Torah. The bulk of the Torah is not that a pre-8 sadar is an esrog and an oat is tefillin. That's not the bulk of the Torah. But it's a part of the Torah. Part. But these are Torah Sheba'al Peh. They're literally oral explanations of the written Torah. And the litmus test to know that we're dealing with that is when you find no debate about them in the Talmud. When you find no debate about it in the Talmud, that tells you that it is an accepted law that goes back all the way to Sinai. Now comes the second category. Hachelak hasheni, heim hadinim, shneimar behem halach l'Moshe miSinai. That's halach l'Moshe miSinai. These are laws that have absolutely no tethering to the text. They are not like tefillin, where there's a verse, which I am interpreting via the accepted rabbinic interpretation. Rather, it is a purely oral law that has absolutely nothing connecting to a text. Okay? Well, there's no text that talks about it. But there was a corpus of law, a small part of the laws, which were purely halacha l'Moshe miSinai, alongside the written law. And this is a pure oral tradition. And for the Rambam, once again, the ein ra'ayot aleim, there's no proofs you can bring for them. It is a pure tradition. V'zeh kimo kein ein cholek alav. This too, nobody argues about. That's the litmus test. Now, what the Rambam achieved by this was, interestingly enough, is he actually, and this is, I think, one of the Rambam's agendas, in a good way, the word agenda is not a bad word, one of the Rambam's agendas is to fight the Karaites. Because the Karaites asked the question, the rabbis came, the Gaonic rabbis, for example, said every single jot and tittle in the Talmud goes back to Sinai. And the Karaites said, prove it. And the Karaites said, what do you mean? You have debates on every page of the Talmud. If it really goes back to Sinai, why is there so much debate? So the Gaonim answered, because of shichacha, because people forgot, because this tradition got corrupted. Now that's not a good argument. You don't want to be making, that's a defensive argument. Why is there debate? So for the Rambam said, I don't want to go that way. I am going to make Torah Sheba'al Peh much smaller. Meaning, what is literally by tradition is this small box of Perushim HaMekubalim and Halach l'Moshe miSinai. That's two categories. The bulk of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, or what we call Torah Sheba'al Peh, which the Rambam didn't call, is going to be different. And that's the third category. Says Rambam, Hachelak
What's
HaShlishi,
an example of the second?
Shiurim. The Gemara says that the measurements are Torah. There is no verse where God talks about, and these are the measurements of meaning.
The leket.
Right. It just, how do you know what's a kazayis, a kabeh? These are all according to the Gemara, halach l'Moshe miSinai. God gave them as a separate little piece of information to Moses, there's no pasuk that you can attach it to. As opposed to tefillin, I have to interpret what it means. I have to interpret what a pre-8 sadar means. I have to interpret what this is, what that is. So the third category, which the Rambam in the introduction, this is the summary. But prior to this part, the Rambam said, this is the bulk of what we find in the Gemara. And it's true, what the Rambam is about to say. The third category, Heim Hadinim Shehotziu Al Darkei Svara. These are the laws that the rabbis derived using logic, and not just logic, but the principles, what we call Hekesh, Kal V'chomer, Gzeira Shava, Svara, logic. And there's debate. Every page of the Talmud on so many of the details of the law. Heim hadinim shotziu al darkei svara v'nafla behem machlokit kemo shezacharnu v'nifsok behem al pi harov. When it comes to these, we will have to determine what the correct law is based on majority. Kemo she'asadnu, as we explain. V'zeh yikre. And this will happen, Kasher shikul hadat notel lekan v'lekan v'idashava. When the argument can go this way or the argument can go that way, and there's no knockout punch. Most of the debates in the Gemara, there's no knockout punch. This one has this svara, this one has this svara, this one has this proof. So you're going to have to determine practically how you're going to act based on majority rule. Ulachein omrim, and that's why you find sometimes the Talmud saying in Yevamot, for example, im halacha nikabel, where one rabbi says, if you have a tradition showing me that this goes back all the way to Sinai, we'll accept it. The im ladin, but if you are making a logical argument based on principles, yesh tshuva, there is a response, and I disagree with you. V'lo nechleku. V'lo hitvakchu ze al ze. The rabbis only never debated, except ela b'davar shelo nishma'a bo halacha. They only debated those areas of Jewish law which take up the bulk of the Talmud, actually, where they did not have a received tradition of what the correct tradition was. The timtza b'chol Talmud shehem chokrim. The Talmud always asks, Eza svara, what was the logic garma machloket bein al cholkim, between the disputants? V'omrim b'mai kamiflage, what are they arguing about? My taima the Rabbi Ploni, what's the reason? My benai, what's the etc. So the Rambam here makes a far-reaching claim. The Rambam makes the claim that machloket is not reflective of a problem with the system. It's not because they forgot and now they're debating which is the correct interpretation. They're debating because it was never established. And human beings can approach a text with different attitudes and come to different conclusions. And this is the nature of the system. Built into the system from the very beginning was the notion that much of the Torah is left there to be interpreted by the rabbis through the principles that they were given by God, passed down to Moshe and the Zakanim, etc. And they were authorized, to use the legal term, this is what we call the constitutive, to create the law. The drashot and the machlokot create law. They don't just try to retrieve law. So this is a very different conception. And for the Rambam, that's the healthiest sign is the machloket is a sign that it's not a oral law in the sense of it was given at Sinai. It wasn't given at Sinai. The law that was derived by this drasha, by this exegetical technique, or this svara, it may be pregnant in the words, it may be even the correct interpretation of the words, but was not given at Sinai. And therefore it kind of exists on its own by rabbinic creativity. So this is the Rambam's conception here of this. Okay, so we'll stop here for this week. We will continue in Yirtz Hashem next week with the Rambam's theory of machloket, and then we will continue and see the rest of the parts of the Torah Sheba'al Peh according to the Rambam. But literally, I will stop using the word Torah Sheba'al Peh because for the Rambam, Torah Sheba'al Peh is only the first two categories. Because it's literally Torah that was passed on orally. This is not passed on orally. This is not Torah Sheba'al Peh. This is halacha, whatever you want to call it. But this is not Torah Sheba'al Peh. Then we'll talk about what is the juridic level of this law. Meaning the first two are clearly what we would call in rabbinic language, d'oraita. They go back to Sinai. Okay? The question about this third category is it may not in its historical origin go back to Sinai, but what status does it have legally after the rabbis have derived the law from the text? What legal status? That's a different question. That's not a historical question. That's a juridic question, a legal question of status. We might give something status X even if it wasn't historically, okay? So when the rabbis use the term d'oraita about a law, what do they mean? That's a question the Rambam is going to address as well, and we have to try to address it as well. Yeah.
So it's really only very few of the right.
So that's the question we have to ask ourselves. According to the Rambam, are very few of what we find in the Talmud really d'oraita, in the full sense of the word.
Can I ask you a question? Avot Beit Din, principles, what does that mean?
A vote?
Yes, Avot Beit Din.
Yeah, that means a principle, yeah. In terms
What
of
do you
what,
mean?
like what? Yeah, Pirkei Avot. No, there means.
No,
the-
it
the-
doesn't. It has nothing to do with fathers, it has to
Okay,
do with
fine.
principles of the Beit Din.
Okay, fine.
So what are the principles?
We'll talk more about with the Rambam's conception. There's many different views about what the principles, the 13 principles of exegesis of Rabbi Yishmael, or the 32 principles of exegesis. We'll get to that.
Was that Avot Beit Din?
Avot Beit Din. Avot Beit Din literally means.
Principles.
Yes. Okay. Fine. Have a good. I have to go. It's good to see you. I have to go
Thank
teach.
you,
Okay.
thank you.
All the best.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
It was-